Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, wherever you are. People from all over the world are with us today. Another series of the Theories of Regulation seminar. And today we are very happy and very lucky to have Professor Cristie with us, who will speak about regulatory roadmaps. Professor Cristie is at the University of British Columbia. She is more specifically at the Allard School of Law, and she's working on regulation and governance. She's doing it in Canada, applying the theory and the research in Canada, the US, and also international arenas. And she works also on financial and securities regulation. Extended research to justice issues and the governance of the legal profession more recently. She published extensively, including two books, one on innovation and the state, and the other one on Canadian securities regulation. And she did many good things, including being co-editor of Regulation and Governance. And I was lucky to have her as a co-editor with me. She's been all over the world, including the EUI, the Hebrew University, Oxford, Utrecht, and so on. And we are very happy and lucky to have you today with us, Cristie, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Thank you, David, for having me here at this distinguished series of lectures, and congratulations to you really for taking advantage of the move to virtual and creating such a fantastic international community of regulatory scholars, as you've done for all these years. And of course, we've all seen the news in Israel, and I really hope that everyone is safe as well. And so hello, everyone. So this topic is about regulatory roadmaps, and it's based on a chapter that I wrote for a book about Fintech, financial technology, which is an area with a particularly fast moving and under-tracked amount of change going on all the time. But I think the question that I tried to pose in that chapter is a question that's relevant more broadly. And really that is, how do we future-proof ourselves, regulation, and social structures that are designed for the public good in the face of really significant ongoing and pervasive change? And so that's really what this chapter has been about and what my talk will be about. Now, I'm going to be focusing on what I call private sector innovation. But let me just, and I see that Bruno Kuna is in the audience. Thank you, Bruno, for discussions we've had on these points. When I say private sector innovation, I don't mean private as in private companies or private actors were involved at every important stage of creating research or technology. So David Mowry and more recently Mariana Mazzucato have demonstrated how much of the innovations around the information economy, and before that around really large chunks of welfare state technology, were owed to public funding. So in the United States, NATO and military spending really contributed enormously to things like the creation of the internet. More recently, science granting agencies for key technologies have created some of the key technologies underpinning the smartphone. And so when I say private sector innovation, what I'm really talking about is a situation where the benefits have been privatized and where the day-to-day operation or implementation or development of innovation is done by private sector companies. And I think that the language of use of private sector innovation is accurate until and unless we properly socialize the benefits of innovation as well. And so in some ways, I think of my presentation as being really an argument in favor of socializing those benefits and thinking about linking private sector innovation more intentionally and more robustly into questions around what is in the public interest and into sort of a more active understanding of regulation of private sector innovation. So now the problem, though, is how. So private sector innovation, whether it's fintech or biotechnology or the platformization of the economy or other developments, is tricky at the best of times. And it's not only a question of moving fast enough and getting accurate information, it's also a question of regulating in a way that takes that pays attention to the public sector values of equity, fairness, justice, the rule of law, and the like. And that takes time. And so for those reasons, regulation always runs into a certain degree of, and I don't like to say that it's behind, because I think that's too strong a term, but it is always in a position of not being entirely up to speed with what might be happening in the private sector. And so let's say, for example, you regulate taxis, and then all of a sudden Uber pops up and it says it's not a taxi, but it's a ride sharing service. And it's not in hiring employees, it's hiring independent contractors. And Uber and Lyft and other ride sharing services take off because they are more closely attuned to the customer experience. They eliminate pain points. People like it better. And what is lost in the process, of course, are centrally regulated standards around cleanliness and courtesy and safety. And instead, you have this sort of decentralized, privatized customer and driver rating system. Okay, so you're the regulator and you think, fine, with time, you come up with a way to impose rules on Uber, maybe at the city level or at some other level. For a period of time. So you find ways to creatively enforce labor laws, minimum wage standards, safety standards. And so this requires some creative thinking, and it requires reaching across pre-existing regulatory boundaries. And then once you've kind of got Uber and Lyft understood and dealt with, along comes a whole other thing. So this is Swarm City, which is, as it says, a blockchain-based marketplace for rides. And so in this case, there is no one to attach to anymore. There's no Uber, there's no central system, there's no employer, and there are only bilateral relationships, transactions based on this permissionless blockchain architecture or infrastructure between, driver and rider. So now how are you going to regulate that? And this is, I think, a good example of the kind of problem that I think a lot of different regulatory models run into when dealing with innovation. So popular images of innovation look something like this, right? Especially from the tech industry. This idea of the sort of optimistic, transcendent, innovative move which transforms the world and solves problems and cures diseases, and which is just better along every metric, right? Bigger, better, faster, stronger, higher, no downsides. And I would like to propose that innovation from a regulatory point of view is not in fact like this at all. Innovation, I would say, is like water. Innovation seeps around structures in unrecognized ways, that sometimes unrecognized in real time. It crosses boundaries, it changes ground rules. So a single drop of water is pretty unremarkable on its own, but many droplets together matter quite a lot. And sometimes we don't see the effects of innovation until it collects seemingly all of a sudden in an unexpected location, as it did during the financial crisis in the over-the-counter derivatives market. Those risks were growing, but they didn't register until they had reached a critical volume. Innovation runs down avenues of opportunity, whether or not outsiders to the process recognize those avenues. It changes the ground rules. It will run under, around, and over obstacles, including seemingly clear regulatory requirements. And it's also like water in its potentially corrosive effect. So it creates its own opportunities. It opens up its own new spaces, and it can destabilize, swamp, or make irrelevant regulatory structures, sometimes in obvious ways, and sometimes in latent or inconspicuous ways. So financial innovations, which are intangible and fast moving, are especially challenging. So financial regulators really are at the operational front line when it comes to trying to make sense of the promise and the risks associated with fintech. So securitization was one thing. It was destabilizing a dozen years ago. I'm not expecting you to read these slides. They are just snapshots of some important articles over the last decade, which have really identified the profoundly destabilizing effects of financial innovation on financial regulation. And there are many ways in which concepts like safe assets ended up being just utterly undermined by financial regulation. Today, I'm going to venture into the obscure and mundane world of securities regulation and the impact of what we call DeFi, decentralized finance. Now, I take these risks as serious because I am of the clear view that regulation really matters. It's at the front line operationally when it comes to making our social commitments real, especially in an area which is as fraught with both potential and risk as an area like financial regulation. So I have a definition of regulation here, which draws on Christopher Hood's and Julia Black's. But I guess I would emphasize that the regulation I'm talking about here really is regulation by the state. I insist on a strong, robust, unapologetic role for the state in regulation. Now, I'm going to be talking about fintech in a particular context today around clearing agencies and DeFi, which I'll explain in a minute. But there are lots of other examples, and not only in finance. The platform economy generally, the Internet of Things, artificial intelligence, machine learning, natural language processing, and all of them have implications for privacy and surveillance and human dignity and social equality and the rule of law. And the notion of the rule of law as something that we should care about and collectively be committed to, which derives from fundamental principles and social commitments, as opposed to something like algorithmic predictions. So the question for me today, and is one that I think regulators should be asking themselves continually, constantly, over and over and over again, which is, how is private sector regulation undermining my assumptions, changing relationships, denaturing products and markets, seeping around regulatory definitions and boundaries right now? Now, this question isn't a substitute for existing regulatory mandates. If you have an obligation to, for consumer protection, then you still have that obligation. And I would say it's also, this question is not a substitute for other regulatory techniques. So, for example, it seems to me that risk-based regulation is actually holding up pretty well over time as being a good mechanism for identifying risks and dealing with them in a proportional manner. But what I would say is that doing rule-based regulation well requires some prior thinking about and then continual reevaluation of the environment and the dynamicism in the environment in a way that rules-based regulation doesn't explicitly incorporate, and it should, right? So you have to keep, so if you're going to be a good rules-based regulator, I would propose that you need to constantly ask yourself how private sector innovation is undermining your assumptions about risks, changing the relationships on which risk-based regulation is structured, and the like. Responding to these questions will really, I think, help regulators to manage change. All right, so let's look at our example, DeFi. And I owe this example to the General Counsel of the Securities Commission here in British Columbia, Amy Iaria, who has been the source of all kinds of great conversations around decentralized finance. So DeFi, decentralized finance, it's the application of technology to eliminate or reduce the role of one or more intermediaries or centralized processes that have traditionally been involved in providing financial services. Now, you can decentralize functions and decision-making at multiple different steps, whether it's record keeping or assumption of risk. There are various different things that you could decentralize. And there's lots of DeFi out there. So The blockchain generally operates on this idea of decentralized finance and decentralized contracting. So I guess I should explain this idea of the smart contract because it is fundamental to DeFi. So a smart contract, which you may have heard about, is really just this. It is an if-then sequence in a computer code such that if thing A happens, then thing B will automatically happen. Smart contracts like this can be hung off a blockchain, which is an immutable record-keeping mechanism. The easiest way to think about it is, a giant Excel spreadsheet in the sky that is extremely difficult to change. And the actual blockchain records transactions, but really, it's this if-then computer sequence that sets the conditions for example, buying or selling, so that once thing A happens, the transaction completes automatically. And so really, the Ethereum blockchain, which is where smart contracts tend to reside, are really just records of what's happening. The blocks are records of transactions. And the miners who build those blocks are really just server farms. And so the point is that the actual transaction happens through the code itself. So the kind of transaction I'm going to be speaking about today is this idea of clearing. So let's say you're buying a share from someone in a company. Between the execution, which is the creation of a legally binding, is this boring, mundane back office middle step called clearing, which looks completely dull and uninteresting, but in fact it is indispensable, because without clearing there is no settlement, right? So how did clearing evolve? It's actually you'll see, and obviously it's a market, and at fairs and markets, traveling markets in Europe in the medieval period, there would be people who would buy and sell, and then there would be often, it evolved, a bookkeeper who would maintain a ledger of who owed what to whom. And in fact, the ledger revolutionized trading in Europe and in the Near East, because it allowed multi-party transactions to be recorded, including across time and space. So the ledger itself then became a record of who owed what to whom, which became a basis for creditors to force debtors to pay. And then in turn, those credit and debit notes, as recorded on the ledger, became themselves a medium of exchange. They became, something that you could pledge back and forth, which you could use to expand credit. And so what evolved actually was a much more scalable system than just everybody owing everyone else individually in real time. Netting began in the late 1500s. So at the end of the fair, there would be this clearing cycle where all the debtors and creditors' balances would be offset. Centralized clearing around stock exchange started in the mid 1800s with credit requirements among club members. And so it operated sort of as a self-regulating member organization where everyone understood their obligations to everyone else. And this in turn permitted other innovations like electronic record bookkeeping instead of having to physically transfer shares. So that's something that happened in the 1970s. So all of this created a system that was more efficient. It was multilateral with netting. And that in turn, became a more streamlined and efficient system. So we still have clearing agencies. You'll see this is the sort of basic securities settlement process. Any transaction has to be cleared, but securities on stock exchanges are kind of a classic example. This sort of demonstrates the netting process, so that the customer only has to do the execution and sees the settlement, and other steps are done at different levels with the clearing agency doing the netting. So what is a clearing agency? This is the definition of a clearing agency in my province under our Securities Act. Similar definitions exist in Securities Acts really, well, across, in the United States, in the UK, and elsewhere. So a clearing agency is a person that in connection with trades and securities acts as an intermediary in paying funds, provides a centralized facility through which trades are cleared, provides a centralized facility as a depository of securities. Most countries now have centralized securities depositories. This is the Israeli one, which is run through the Tel Aviv Stock Exchange. And in the United States and the UK and Canada and elsewhere, there are centralized clearing agencies. And they tend to get regulated where they are systemically significant. So because they are these intermediaries, if they were to fail, it would cause massive market disruption. And so after the financial crisis, a lot of work was spent making sure that centralized clearing agencies were robustly regulated, and also giving them more responsibilities to sort of manage certain kinds of trades that had been bilateral before. So all of this, and I should say these principles for financial market infrastructures really are focused on enhancing safety and efficiency, limiting systemic risk, fostering transparency and financial stability. All right, so relative to that, the blockchain and this idea of smart contracts clearing is an entirely different animal and based on very different assumptions. So if you are a crypto optimist and a sort of a tech optimist, there is a strong strain that assumes that all intermediation is really just rent seeking and power, and that it needs to be eliminated. And the fact that there is this distributed ledger technology, which I'm just calling the blockchain, that creates this immutable record, which is transparent to everyone and which can clear these smart contracts, so to speak, is seen as really being an entirely different alternative. So you'll see here a conventional clearinghouse model for clearing securities as opposed to a blockchain based model where there is no need for this centralized clearinghouse, because you can hang these smart contracts right off the blockchain. And then there's this idea of the atomic swap, which is really just entirely between individuals, no intermediary at all. So fascinating, interesting, and really very novel in this world. Also inefficient, right? Not multilateral. There's no opportunity for netting. There are no governance standards other than what is in the code, and there are scalability problems. So if you are, IOSCO or one of the regulators in this space, what are you going to do with this? It's really quite analogous to, moving from taxi medallions to figuring out Uber and then having to figure out Swarm City. So atomic swaps are, again, there's no there to connect or to attach if you're a regulator. So I want to propose that there are 4 essential questions that could hopefully help regulators guide thinking as they try to understand what they're dealing with here. What did the regulator know and not know? How does it know it? How is regulation structured and what flows from those assumptions? How adaptable, resilient, and capable of learning is your regulatory structure? And what strategic choices are available to frame and interpret what's happening? So in the interest of time, I'm going to really focus, I think, on the second question around how regulation is structured and what flows from this. But we'll quickly go through some pretty slides, hopefully pretty slides, about the first question too. What does the regulator know and not know? And this is, really quite a fundamental epistemological question, right? So is this kind of innovation, are our typical models of innovation going to work when it comes to network-based innovations or substantially different structures like this? How much does reputation make a difference to how innovations grow? This is obviously a map of Norway, where a number of Norwegian municipalities bought crazy structured financial instruments from Wall Street during the financial crisis, really based on the reputation of the innovators rather than on a conviction that those particular innovations were sensible for them. Who are the incumbents? Who are the disruptors? And are those terms even entirely useful in these kinds of spaces? And additionally, what about the role of personality? So if Norwegian municipalities were buying these structured financial products based on Wall Street's reputation, that suggests that understanding that this is Vitalik Buterin, who has created Ethereum and has a sort of an almost guru-like presence in this space. How does the status of particular individuals actually affect the innovations that we see? How much innovation is actually sort of just what Claude Lévi-Strauss called bricolage, or just kind of making do with what is at hand? So I want to suggest too that there are particular areas where decentralized finance will make more sense, and other areas where it'll make less sense, depending on sort of how many intermediaries you can move out, and how much of their profit from those activities you can claim in other ways. All right, but let's talk about how regulation is structured and what flows from these choices. So any regulatory structure is going to be beset by inevitable choices that we make around the boundaries of regulatory jurisdiction, around the assumptions that go into a regulatory approach. And there is no such thing as a perfect regulatory structure for all purposes. And so understanding what the positive and negative attributes of your regulatory structure are, understanding the limits of your assumptions and your visibility into a situation is really extremely important. And it's, I would say, perhaps one of the hardest problems when dealing with something as fast moving as financial innovation. So thinking about regulatory boundaries, for example, the blockchain-based smart contracts are not even limited by financial jurisdiction or regional or national jurisdiction. Blockchains can be used for any transaction by anyone. And as compared to the old sort of centralized structure, we're dealing with something really quite fundamentally different. So in clearing, and for the principles of financial market infrastructure, what we are seeing is that there are a series of very important obligations which really go to systemic stability, which attach to this central clearinghouse. And now we are seeing through DeFi permissionless blockchains where there is no authority that can be attached and dealt with. So in genuinely new contexts like this, it's very hard to rely on past experience and analogy to comparable examples. It's not even always clear what an accurate analogy or comparable example might be. In the run-up to the financial crisis, there were lots of characterization errors, right? Things that people thought would operate in a particular way turned out to operate in a very different way. And so what are the characterization errors that we might see here? And and where does our existing model not fit? Well, this is the obvious one, right? Entity-based regulation assumes that there is such a thing as a central clearing agency that you can attach, and that it has a geographical and jurisdictional location, that it needs to be regulated, which is something that crypto optimists would not actually agree with, that there needs to be any flawed human regulation of something as elegant as the blockchain. We assume that it's important to regulate clearing agencies if they become of a systemically significant size, because they can be vectors for systemic risk. We assume that clearing operates to create a fairly level playing field for people operating in that sphere. The blockchain is an entirely different thing. So we haven't even really characterized blockchains in terms we understand. So is the blockchain a commons? Is it a market? Is it just a series of peer-to-peer relationships? Is it a community? Is it an ecosystem, which is what the Ethereum people like to call it? And this is especially true for the decentralized autonomous organizations that operate on the blockchain to transact, or invest or whatever. So the lack of internal governance structures in the blockchain is the point, right? If you're a blockchain evangelist. But what that means is that the normal regulatory requirements around clearing, for example, don't work, right? So advocates would say that's a good thing. Blockchain advocates would say we're just getting rid of a rent-seeking intermediary, but so what? So is that how we should understand this? What do we do with concerns about systemic risk, transparency, fairness, and the like, which used to attach to the central clearing agency? And similarly with smart contracts. So this language of smart contracts suggests an equivalence between these if-then software iterations and an actual legal contract. Is that necessarily the best analogy? So just because they call it a smart contract doesn't mean it's necessarily actually a contract. How do you understand a software glitch in an if-then statement in contract terms? What about other legal doctrines from contract law? Which ones apply? So what about force majeure or mac out clauses, right? If the market collapses, you can get out of contract, or other external considerations that maybe should vitiate immutable or irreversible blockchain contracts, like duress. Who clears the trade? In the software? How does that make sense? In a cross-border contract, where does it clear and whose law applies? And what do you do if provisions of this if-then statement in a software smart contract violates a fundamental principle of law from that jurisdiction or another jurisdiction, for example, to deprive a rightful owner of their securities or the cash for selling them? And there are other fairness concerns as well around, oligopolistic behavior, barriers to entry, competition, all kinds of things. So who is going to regulate that? It's my new favorite slide. So are we using the right analogies? It's hard to even say. And in addition, we need to understand that we are dealing with highly reactive, complex, adaptive systems that operate in a reflexive relationship to their regulatory environment. So there are system effects and amplification that could come into play at scale, right? And it's crucial to understand that how private sector innovation evolves will depend very much on how the regulation is structured. And private sector innovation, we should assume that one of the key purposes of private sector innovation in this space is explicitly to circumvent the regulation you just built, right? So what kinds of tools are required by a regulator to deal with this? Data quality, the ability to learn and to adapt. I would also suggest, so triple loop learning is an important concept which could be incorporated more explicitly into risk-based regulation. And I would also suggest that there are broader sort of normative and messaging aspects to this. So the Crypto Anarchist Manifesto is, a key normative touchstone for folks in the sort of anarcho-capitalist libertarian, view of crypto and of the world, right? So are we going to accept that at the public level, or are we not? So I'll just close by saying none of this is easy, and nor is some of this in the standard wheelhouse of folks like lawyers, the people that I try to educate. It involves bringing in new skills, new training from data analysts and others. and really avoiding the error of looking for the keys, looking for your lost keys under the street lamp because that's where the light is, right? It really is a question of interrogating what you can see and what you can't, and starting from that first principle. And that's it for me. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Cristie, for a clear and fascinating presentation. And I'd like to invite comments, questions from the audience. So who wants to go first? I'll put myself also in the, I see Daniel Brody raising his finger. So Daniel, please.
Okay, thank you very much for a very insightful presentation. I'm Director for the Center for Financial Regulation and Innovation at Strathclyde University. I want to focus a bit more on what you were talking about on disintermediation and the banking system. You've said a lot about smart contracts and the blockchain, but obviously if you have a process of disintermediation, you're actually cutting out the banking sector. And that has immense implications for the way that capital is provided, for the way that leverage is put into the system, for the way that essentially we use central banks to stimulate or slow down the economy. So I just wanted to hear what your thoughts were on the disintermediation that all of this implies.
Yes, thank you. So I should start by saying I'm not a scholar of monetary policy or banking policy specifically, but I think, I think the way that I find it most useful to think about this is really just in terms of boundary questions, right? So there are macroeconomic implications to micro decisions, right? And understanding the the potential implications of, for example, decentralized finance on monetary policy or on national economies' ability to control inflation or manage interest rates or manage economic growth is a real concern, right? So if hypothetically everybody stops using banks and everybody gets onto some version of Alipay or WeChat or whatever, Apple Pay, and that involves the loss of some very significant monetary tools to central governments to manage their own economies. And so I would distinguish that, I think, from blockchain-based digital currencies like stable coins, which are being created by governments themselves. I just see that as fiat currency in a new form. But if people are moving away from fiat currency altogether, or from banking structures altogether, I think there are enormous implications. And I guess I would also say, just I don't want to go on too long, but banking regulation and the regulation of the technology sector are two very different things, which operate in two different, based on different sets of assumptions, neither of which are perfect in my view. But even just thinking about sort of macroprudential regulation of the banking sector, if those rules don't apply to tech companies, right? And so it almost seems to me that we need to think comprehensively about tech and banking together if we want to safeguard against, systemic risk, for example. And that involves rethinking how we regulate tech companies, but also rethinking how we regulate banks.
Thank you, Cristie. Anyone else? I see Dieter. So please, Dieter, and then Johannes, and then Ruth. So Dieter first, please.
Hello, thank you. Thank you for a very interesting presentation and for very entertaining slides. I really enjoyed them. Question, you present more or less the regulator as somebody with public interest in mind and trying to catch up with the developments caused by financial innovation in particular. where do you see the role of regulators coming into play in terms of pushing financial innovation, fintech, for the reason to have economic advantages? So we currently not just see trying to regulate, but also trying to deregulate in particular ways to have competitive advantages, especially around financial centers. The other question would be around the financial innovation trilemma that Brahma and Yadav have identified, and more or less the question of what are you making about this trilemma, and the question, what kind of regulation do we need in order to properly regulate financial innovation? Is it as simple rules, or is simple rules an illusion? Is this something that would be possible? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. All right, so I guess I would start by saying, yes, I have significant concerns about regulators in different jurisdictions entering into a competitive race to attract financial innovators to their shores. I also have concerns about how regulatory fintech sandboxes are set up to sort of try to catalyze investment in particular ways. In my own country, our largest province, Ontario, just created a task force which tried to, which really will do substantially gut their securities regulatory structure in the interest of fostering competition and competitiveness, and stronger markets. I'm not ancient, but I feel like I've been here before in 1999 and 2007, and I am a little bit boggled that we are here again. And I think the competitive impulse between jurisdictions is so strong that we conveniently keep forgetting, how competition between jurisdictions can lead to a race to the bottom, and that how financial crises are so enormously harmful. And so I find that very frustrating, frankly. So another way in which I think regulators actually increase innovation is in terms of how they structure their rules or their requirements. So for example, if you have a regulatory approach, a more principles-based regulatory approach, which is something I generally support, which creates an open set of rules assuming, or an open set of standards assuming that there will be innovation in a space. Sometimes what you get is more innovation in that space, right? So you create a porous regulatory framework, and that in turn creates the requirement for more porousness, more porosity. And so that's another way in which I think regulatory structure can actually affect, can augment innovation in sometimes unintentional ways. In terms of what to do about it, I don't think rules-based regulation makes sense in a lot of situations, because I think it's effectively like trying to paper over a moving object. However, I think there are times when, for all their failings, and there are lots of them, rules have the benefit of certainty and clarity and enforceability, and those rules are, sometimes worth the cost that is paid in terms of flexibility and responsiveness and congruence and the like. And I'd be happy to talk further about it.
Thank you, Cristie. Now, Johannes, please, and then Ruth.
Hi, everybody. Actually, my first time participating in that group. It's very interesting, and thanks for your inspiring presentation. And in fact, my question, I think, is related to what you just talked about in Dieter's earlier question. And so there's, innovation is not generically good or bad, right? I mean, there's certain types of innovations that are sort of beneficial and others that are not. And in many of the public policy debates, especially in the sort of groups that I deal with, are mostly high tech and IT scholars. There is sort of this bias in favor of innovation, right? I mean, it's like what Vince Moska called the digital sublime. We think everything is good. But you sort of presented a different view, except in your last comment, right? In your presentation, it sounded like most regulation was designed to undermine regulations, and that may be true or may not be true. It may also be intended to bypass regulations that sort of prevent beneficial types of innovation, right? And so sorting these out, right? The direction of innovation, in addition to the consequences of innovation, might be a role for regulation. And I'm wondering whether you could say a little bit more. And I think for the problem of sorting good innovation from bad innovation, the roadmap alone doesn't do it. You may need a different metaphor, like guardrails. Okay, so in addition to the roadmap, now you need guardrails that we channel regulation in a desirable direction. And the interesting thing about digital types of innovations is that they're very malleable. Right? It's not like a chemical process where you need sort of fixed proportions of inputs, right? Digital innovation is way more flexible. And I think regulation has a really important function to channel the direction of innovation in a desirable way. But then you need sort of principles. What are those principles that are embedded in the guardrails, right? And I was wondering whether you could say a few more things about this.
Sure, thank you very much. Oh, I have so many views on this. But let me just, I guess, start by saying, yes, so I wrote a book in 2017, and one of the things that inspired me to write that book was, first of all, the view that existed before the financial crisis that, you know, innovation of any sort was sort of by definition beneficial, right? And then following the financial crisis, I would hear the explanation that innovation generally is by definition beneficial, but financial innovation is some kind of, you know, malign version of it, right? There's something different about financial regulation or financial innovation relative to everything else. And I don't actually buy either of those claims. I think, first of all, it's extremely hard to say ex ante whether a particular innovation is going to end up being good or bad, right? So securitization did marvels in terms of, you know, increasing people's access to capital, in terms of, you know, expanding access to a more democratic economy in many ways, until it stopped being so good because it had sort of achieved a certain amount of market perfection, and then became, you know, beset with rent seeking. So I don't think you can say ex ante what is going to turn out to be good and what's going to turn out to be bad. And so I resist the label of good and bad innovation as something that we can sort of just point to, right? This is good, that's bad. You know, but I guess I would also say that baked into words like good and bad are a series of very context-specific normative choices about what you care about, right? So we can all, I think, agree that equality is good. Great. So communications technology, thinking about the internet, has produced certain kinds of equality. So if what you care about is global equality, standards of living in some parts of the world have been increased by the fact that there is communications technology which can link those folks up in, you know, as part of a productive economic system with folks in the West, right? If what you care about is your domestic equality, I think there's all kinds of evidence to suggest that globalization generally has, you know, has not assisted in equality within the United States, for example, right? So even concepts that we think we all agree on, I think are very contestable. And for those reasons, those guardrails that you refer to, I don't really see as being a regulatory job. I think of them as being a political policy social job. And with those in place, then I think the regulator, you know, has to have the ability to make useful decisions. But yes, I resist the idea that there's, you know, that we can know in advance what we want to channel and what we want to avoid.
Thank you, Cristie. And now Ruth and Johannes, of course. We don't hear you, Ruth. You need to unmute yourself.
Yeah,
Great.
thank you. Hello, Cristie. I'm Ruth Plato-Shinar. We corresponded and you sent me your article. Thank you very much. And thank you for a very, very interesting presentation. You referred again and again to the need of the regulator to catch up with the private sector, to get information, to study. And then in the list, in your list of questions, you asked questions like, how can the regulator get all the information? What information? What type of information? So I'm interested to know what are your thoughts about mechanisms like Sandbox or Innovation Hub that allows a kind of mutual learning, collaboration between the regulator and the regulated entities. And if you think that this kind of mechanism can answer one of your questions.
Thank you, Ruth. Lovely to see you in person. Thank you for coming. Yes, so I am quite keen on the idea of the sandbox, but quite frustrated with how I see them actually operating in practice. So I think in a perfect world, the sandbox. So so I'm a regulation person, and I'm really quite committed to regulation being important. And so I look at it from the regulatory perspective. I care less about mutual learning than I care about the regulator learning about what's going on in the private sector. And for those that don't know, a sandbox it exists in fintech, and these days increasingly around legal professional regulation too. And the idea is that the regulator creates a space where the normal rules don't apply, so that people can innovate and come up with new ways of, meeting regulatory objectives. And so, for example, the normal rules around what constitutes a bank don't apply, so that you can try and create, consumer-facing products more without getting in trouble with the banking regulator. And so people would apply to the regulator to get into this sandbox, and they get to play in the sandbox. And most sandboxes have a sort of an up or out window. So you have 2 years in the sandbox where you can try and get your idea off the ground. And after 2 years, the regulator will either give you a permanent sort of seal of approval saying we recognize this business structure or this approach, or they'll say time to wind up. And so I think that the sandbox would be a fantastic opportunity for regulators to really understand some of the most innovative things happening in a particular sector. But I think they should have extremely demanding information sharing requirements, for the entire time that someone's in the sandbox. I think from the regulatory perspective, it should be all about getting into the mindset of those companies and understanding that. I think that should be the price of admission. And my impression is that it is not, partly because of the interjurisdictional, competition that Dieter alluded to. So in a perfect world, I think they'd be great.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Cristie. We are almost in the end of the session. Anyone wants to come in, or if not, I am happy to go in. No one. So let me come with my comment or question, Cristie. You started the presentation with the future is private. The slide was. And I would say, after looking at what's going on in fintech and financial and securities regulation in general, would you agree that the future is about regulation, and that we are going to have more and more regulation? Sometimes, soft regulation, sometimes hard regulation, but still regulation is central for capitalism, financial capitalism.
So David is frozen-ish for me. Is he? Yeah. Can you see me? And am I moving?
Yes.
Okay. Okay. Thanks.
It's okay.
I think, David, I think it's such an important question, and to use, the overused term of the moment, I would say that we're at an inflection point in some ways. So on the one hand, I think there is in North America in the post-Trump era, because of course in Canada we're affected by that too. There's a move to a more progressive, pro-regulatory perspective, and so younger scholars that I talk to, interestingly, often want to see a return to a more robust, almost welfare state style of regulations. People believe that from the 1990s onwards, some people believe the pendulum swung too far from sort of public priorities and public regulation, and that it's time to change that. And to me, that has felt like a sea change over the last several years, 5 years, 7, I don't know. I feel as though I've seen a conceptual shift in how people talk about regulation, which I think is very exciting. But then on the other hand, I see things like the race to the bottom happening in fintech, and the competitive drives between different countries. And it makes me wonder whether those sort of more robust understandings of public regulation are actually going to win the day. So I don't know.
It's an open question still. And this is a good point to thank you for a brilliant presentation. We are grateful for taking the time to present in the series, and we hope to see you again in the series, you, Cristie, and all of you in the audience. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Bye, Cristie. Have a nice day, and all of you.